Can you guys see the screen?
Yep.
Yes.
Wonderful. So thank you, Amin, again for that introduction. So as he mentioned, I'm a clean energy and technology analyst at the International Energy Agency, where I work within the World Energy Outlook team. And some of the insights that I'm going to be presenting today, it's from a work that we did just over a year ago on clean energy transitions in the greater Horn of Africa. And I will talk about more about like what region we looked at and so on. One of the challenges like of trying to find data on a lot of developing countries, and particularly for Somalia, is like resources for legitimate surveys, data availability, and others. So I hope this will bring like some new information to you all who might be familiar with the region more than me. So without further ado, just a quick overview of like the work that we do at the World Energy Outlook team, where we do effectively knowledge product reports. We do obviously our World Energy Outlook, which is an annual publication, but also we do special reports such as the Net Zero Roadmap, the African Energy Outlook that we published in 2022, which is a biannual report, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, and others. The work that we do in the agency, specifically in this team, is a work of modeling and analysis. So we do like scenarios to enable decision makers to consider multiple futures and understand key drivers and implications. And these scenarios allow stakeholders to embed climate and other goals into policy and investment strategies. So, we model 3 core scenarios. The first one is the steps, which is effectively a business as usual scenario, but we do assume that the current policies in place today stay in place for, let's say, up to 2030. So basically, where do current policies take us by the end of this decade and further down the line to 2050? The second scenario that we model is the APS, which is the announced pledges scenario. This is a scenario that basically takes into account the promises, if you will, by policymakers. So when a politician gets up, like on a podium and says that there are certain targets or, like objectives by its administrations, when they are not in law, when these are not legislated, this is what we model in the APS. And the third scenario is the net zero by 2050 scenario, which is a scenario where basically, like where we would need to go to get to net zero by 2050. So a lot of the analysis that we normally do would focus on this. So where are we currently heading? How far do the promises by politicians get us, and current, like investment pledges and so on, and where we actually be heading if we were on a pathway compatible to with net zero emissions by 2050 scenario. Now for the work of this particular report that I will be presenting today, we will be looking at the steps scenario, which is where do current policies take us to 2030, as well as an Africa case, which is not a net zero by 2050. It's a scenario that basically assumes that certain SDGs will be met by 2030, particularly universal access to both electricity and clean cooking. So first, let me define briefly for us the Greater Horn of Africa, which is what we focused this report on, was 8 focus countries. So it was Djibouti, Eritrea, Ethiopia, Kenya, and Somalia, which is your horn. And then the Greater Horn, we added to this report as well, South Sudan, Sudan, and Uganda. And as you might know, of course, these countries are diverse, and each one has its own specificities economically, culturally, but also in regards of the energy sector. The region is home to some of the fastest growing economies, but also areas facing ongoing conflicts. The region has dynamic, young, and increasingly urban population. Its economy is set to grow considerably, and so demand for energy. Yet many obstacles remain to reach regional stability and socioeconomic development. Underdeveloped energy infrastructure, high vulnerability to climate change impacts, and very low electrification rates in some countries, particularly, for example, in Somalia, as well as issues of conflict translated into rising number of refugees, have also been tormenting the region for many years. Now, speaking of energy more specifically now, sorry, let me see if I can get this. So the drivers for energy demand that we will be looking at today at some point are population, economic growth, and the rapid urbanization of the region. And this offers huge opportunities for the fast adoption of clean energy systems. With the right policies, of course, and investment levels, countries can achieve several SDG targets in the coming decade. For example, of course, achieving universal access to electricity and clean cooking by 2030 in line with the SDG targets, increase the share of modern renewables to almost 25% and 95% in the power sector. So the region obviously holds great potential, not only with hydropower, but also with geothermal, and to use 30% more energy to fuel an economy that would be 2 times its size by the end of this decade. Obviously, there are challenges, which are those that I hinted at before. Achieving this, which are the financing issues, which were exacerbated by the COVID-19 crisis, and the growing climate risk, which also Amin touched upon during his presentation. Climate change poses substantial drought and agricultural risk to the region, and specifically for a country like Somalia, where agricultural and livestock exports make the bulk of its economy. Obviously, climate risks pose a huge threat to the welfare of its citizens and its constituencies. So lastly, just to mention that the IA report that I will be talking about today with you about the Greater Horn, it's freely available on our website. You can look at it. You can take a look at it to get more in-depth details on what I'm going to be talking here today. Sorry, I'm struggling with both screens. So first off, just to start with energy access, as is central to the region's overall development, and how has the region evolved and how can it expand in terms of energy access? So what has happened in the region over the first 2 decades of this century? So today, half of the population, or around 140 million people, still lack access to electricity in the region. There's been strong improvements made over the last decade, with 8 million people gaining access annually on average. But behind this regional average of 8 million, countries show individually diverse progress rates. So for example, obviously, we know that Kenya and Ethiopia have been leading the way, and around 80% of the connections that have been made over this period have been in those 2 countries. However, looking at the last 2 years, this progress has stagnated, with utilities facing increased debt as they took on losses to keep bills affordable through the COVID-19 pandemic, and how high energy prices caused by the war in Ukraine. The IEA estimates that around 5 million more people live without access as of 2021 than they did before the pandemic. So this is something that we estimated not only for Somalia or for the East Africa region, but also for the continent more broadly speaking, and some other parts of the world where the actual number of people without access to electricity increased for the first time in these poly-crisis years of 2021, 2022, due to COVID and the energy crisis due to the war in Ukraine. Looking at clean cooking access, the road to universal access for people is even steeper. Today, less than 15% of the region's population has access to modern and clean cooking solutions, and this represents more than 250 million people that rely still on traditional cooking fuels. So we're talking firewood, animal dung, and any kind of firewood that you can get your hands on. Here again, access rates are uneven across the region. So Sudan has the highest access rate with over 50% of people, followed by Kenya with around 17%. But for the rest of the countries, and particularly for Somalia, the access rates is well below 10%, if not even below 5% right now. For the population that uses LPG, liquefied petroleum gas, the recent price spikes pushed many people actually to go back to leave LPG behind, which is a clean cooking solution for, in terms of its emissions and health impacts, to go back to traditional gathered biomass. And to 2013 steps, which again is where we would get with the current policies that are in place, with the current financial environment. According to these policies, the region has, as a whole, falls short of achieving universal access by 2030, with still 110 million people lacking electricity access, and only with Kenya managing to provide access for its entire population with the current policies that it has in place, and with Ethiopia coming nearby at around 90%. In the Africa case, which again would assume that that everyone gains access in the region by 2030, including in Somalia, reaching universal access to clean cooking requires an unprecedented action in the region, as this is the case across the continent, really, for all of Africa, not only for Somalia and East Africa. So this would translate in providing clean cooking fuels and devices to more than 30 million people per year. And the hope is that, as you heard from, like the examples of Kenya and Ethiopia, is that there's a lot of success stories in Africa as well as in the region. So some countries are doing, like the right things in order to bridge the access gap. And let me skip to the second slide on access, which is what you see here on the right is a map of the region of the Greater Horn of Africa, where we did GIS mapping to effectively see how will people be gaining access to 2030 if all of them were to gain access, based on like the geographical locations of, so how far from a grid do you live from an existing grid or from a planned grid, a power grid. So according to this geospatial analysis, at least the least cost pathway, so this is something else that we model, is like the cheapest option. So it's not only enough for me to live nearby an existing grid, but also it has to be like the cheapest way for me to connect to electricity. So this analysis shows that a combination of technologies needed, as you can see on the left from the pie chart. Grid extension would connect almost 60% of households without access today, as these are located within the reach of a planned or existing power grid. Mini grids would help connect around a third of the population cost effectively and quickly, and the rest would be through standalone systems, which is like when you just have a solar panel on top of your home, being completely off the grid from everyone else around you. This is achievable in principle, as the Greater Horn of Africa is a world leader in off-grid access companies. Ethiopia and Kenya, again, as the two leaders, together account for 30% of the global solar home system sales, solar home system and appliances sales globally. So this is huge. So these two countries alone account for a third, roughly speaking, of all the sales of solar home systems and appliances. And these countries, along with Uganda, are what we call the front runners in Africa for mini grid expansion. Somalia has been able to develop an off-grid market. And as you can see from the map, mini grids and standalone system are the least cost option that we see for the country moving forward in order to provide access. So some of the recommendations here, like having heard from, like the success of other countries near the border in Somalia, would be in the near term to remove import duties and other taxes on access equipment, expanding affordability support of off-grid systems. So again, sometimes even though like the government might not be charging a tax or a duty on certain things that companies are importing, the price tag of some of this equipment is still too high. So there must be like an affordability support system provided by the state or some other entity, maybe NGOs or philanthropies, for people to be able to buy these off-grid solutions. And another important one, which we'll be discussing again later, is to put in place the legal frameworks to tap into international climate finance. So what does this mean? An enabling environment, basically, right? So people need to be able, investors need to be able to look at Somalia or the region and see, like a stable environment where they can invest and eventually make a return on their investment. And again, long-term planning would be, again, concerted government and international support in order to reach these levels, which again can only be possible through the creation of that enabling environment that I was discussing about. Now, looking at the CO2 emissions of the country, Somalia specifically, this is not the region, they have been increasing over the first 2 decades of the century. And when we zoom into, like what's driving this increase in emissions, since, like we have seen some inroads of solar home systems in order to provide electricity, we see that population, which is the purple line that you see on the right figure, the population growth has outpaced the reductions in carbon intensity, which are the blue line. So the carbon intensity has been decreasing, relatively speaking, because of, again, some of these off-grid solutions that have been made inroads in the country. But again, population growth has been so strong that has outpaced the, let's say, the emissions reductions from the shift from, like traditional uses of biomass or oil or other fossil fuels into solar. And this is not unique to Somalia. This is happening in, like many other parts of Africa. But I think it was something important to highlight here. Another thing that I would like to zoom in here, which is very important for, like our climate goals and ambitions, is what you see in the orange line, which is TPED, is total primary energy demand by unit of GDP. So this is energy intensity, which roughly translates into energy efficiency. But looking at the energy intensity, basically we see that it has stagnated. So not a lot of economic growth has happened. We can tell by this graph. And we will look at, like what can be done in order to address and improve energy intensity, looking at Somalia and neighboring countries. So what has been the evolution of energy intensity, as this will be a central element in order to achieve the clean energy transition pathway for Somalia and the region more broadly. So the first indicator of energy efficiency is, again, energy intensity, which is measured by what I described, the energy use in economic activity, which is energy input by unit of GDP. So here what you see on top of the graph is tons of oil equivalent per $1 million. And the regional intensity is about 140 tons of oil equivalent per $1 million, which is slightly above that of sub-Saharan Africa, as you can see from the figure. This is excluding South Africa because it's a very industrialized country. But as you can see, this varies greatly between countries. So you can see that it's very low in countries like Djibouti, and then it's almost twice the size as it is in Djibouti in Ethiopia, where like there's a lot of value-added industry sector, which accounts for like a significant portion of its GDP, and then obviously Somalia, which stands out, where the agriculture sector prevails, but also the power system is based largely entirely on inefficient and carbon-intensive generators, which have seen no change over the period from 2015 to 2020. And why is this important? Not only because obviously these are very inefficient and carbon-intensive, but also because they are very expensive. So the price of energy in Somalia right now is around 3 times the regional average, around $1 per kilowatt hour, whereas in countries like Djibouti or neighboring countries can be like 30 cents. So not only it's harmful for the environment, it's harmful for the people, it's also very expensive to continue using these systems. And as you can see, like there's been some improvements in some countries, but roughly in some has remained the same. So the improvement, regionally speaking, has been less than 1% per year over the second decade of the century. Going forward in the steps, we see this stagnating, so there's going to be very little progress if not further action is taken by policymakers. And then in the Africa case, going to 2030, in order to meet some of the climate targets that I was describing before, we would need to get an average annual intensity improvement that is much higher than what we've seen recently of around 4% points. And this pace is challenging, of course, but achievable and comparable to what other countries and regions have achieved in the past. So as you can see, like India and China, also over a decade period, reached similar amounts or even exceeded that average annual energy intensity improvement, which means that like it can be done if the right policies are in place. And now, sorry, because I'm speaking a lot, but just to wrap it up with some closing remarks. The first one is like establishing. So these closing remarks, sorry, just to wrap up on like how Somalia could take forward like its climate and energy ambitions. The first one is like to establish a foundational energy access program and elevating them to the national priority. So this effectively means develop a national strategy, which Somalia does periodically. Now they're on their 9th national development plan, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, MPD. Yeah. And again, the goal should be specific, identify the key stakeholders, such as governments, private sector entities, and define actions and timelines. The second would be to create a conducive policy environment to advance access to energy services. So this basically means having a strong local supply chain in order to achieve the widespread adoption of access and energy efficiency solutions. As it is important to establish the policies that will aid the growth and expansion of local manufacturing and distribution and retail networks. Third would be channeling the funding through an effective set of instruments. So this would mean, like getting rid of inefficiencies, corruption, and other malpractices that could be taking place. So, like not only having in place instruments supporting the energy value chain and the market development that I was touching on the second point, but also the instruments that we talked about before in order to address the affordability challenges faced by the consumers themselves. So how can consumers, be able to access these systems in an affordable manner? And the last point, just to wrap up, would be advancing, obviously, collaboration on energy access and services. So, like a lot of this means commit the country to reporting on development and investment, which boils down to data availability and, like being able to access data, which is something that we've at the agency struggle a lot with a lot of developing countries, including with Somalia. And, like if the work of Somalis for Sustainability or some other patriots like Amin and Hussein want to take on this task, that would be greatly appreciated by those that do analytical work like the IEA and other bodies. So I'll stop there with the presentation, and if there are questions, happy to take, and like happy to have a discussion on Somalia, the region, Africa, energy transitions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bruno, for that timely sort of discussion on clean energy, especially considering the Green Climate Fund's recent commitment to $100 million for Somalia in the coming years towards sustainable developments. So yeah, we'll open up the floor for any questions at this point. Feel free to unmute yourselves or drop them in the chat